Okay, so in the last modules, we are talking about how plants feed and support themselves on land and not dry out. And those sets of environmental pressures are pretty fundamental, and plants evolve most of those pretty quickly in the history of plant evolution. Reproduction is the harder thing. It's always more complicated than feeding. And so a lot of the adaptations to reproduce successfully on land took a little bit longer. Some of them start pretty early, but the ones that turn out to be most important are pretty late in the evolutionary history of plants. And that's the focus of this set of modules, is how plants figured out how to reproduce successfully on land. Um, and for most students, because you're not plants, let's be honest, you think very much in the way that humans think and not the way that plants experience the world. This is probably going to be the hardest set of modules. So I'm going to do my best to make these more bite-sized so that each kind of big idea is in its own little module. So let's talk about this. So the reproduction of plants fundamentally picks up where the reproduction of seaweeds, the multicellular eukaryotic photosynthetic non-plants reproduced, which is alternation of generations. So if you didn't get it before, you absolutely need to know it now, through and through, because it's going to get way harder than it was before. So just a refresher, this is where we had before. Alternation of generations involves two different, in a way, organisms in the history of one life cycle. There's a sporophyte, all of which the cells are diploid, alternating with a multicellular gametophyte. And critically important, the sporophyte and the gametophyte are both multicellular. They're both organisms. One's haploid, the gametophyte, one's diploid, the sporophyte. And the sporophyte, not surprisingly, produces a single cell called a spore, and the gametophyte produces a gamete. And because you know your processes so clearly now, we know that the spore is produced, well, if we're going diploid to haploid, then that's going to be meiosis. And the part of the plant that does this is a sporangium, which is an organ. Okay, so the sporangium is the only part of the plant that does meiosis. Just like in animals, it's the testes and ovaries are the only part of the animal that does meiosis. So that's how the spores are produced. And then the process that produces the gametes, unlike in animals, is mitosis. And then the spore is single-celled. It grows by mitosis into a multicellular haploid gametophyte that does mitosis to produce the gamete. Then other gametes find each other, they fuse together in fertilization, and then they form the single-celled zygote. And then the zygote grows by mitosis into the adult sporophyte. Okay, so this in a nutshell is alternation of generation. So alternation of generations. A sporophyte phase, multicellular, alternating with a multicellular gametophyte phase. Okay, now, where do plants pick up? Well, to do this as a seaweed, it's pretty easy. Spores are in water, sporophytes are in water, gametophytes in water, gametes, zygotes, all of this is underwater. And so the spores, the zygote, the baby, the gametes, these things aren't going to dry out. And the water is going to transport them so that the spore can go far away in order to grow up, and the gametes can find each other in the water. On land, all of this is different. We need to protect the spores, keep it from drying out. Protect the gametes, keep them from drying out. Protect the baby, keep that from drying out. So how do we do this? Well, these are the first early steps. We're going to kind of break up the evolution of plant reproduction into phases. The first phase is going to have a bunch of early stuff. One, we're going to add a gametangium. I will tell you as just a person of words, gametangium is my favorite word on earth. There's something about the mouth feel of this word, gametangia. It just feels fun to say. If you haven't said it, say gametangium. One gametangium, two gametangia. I love this word. It just feels good. Um, this is the equivalent of the sporangium to make gametes. So the sporangium makes spores. The gametangium is an organ that makes gametes. Again, this would be kind of like the testes and ovaries of a plant, the gametangium. The name of this depends on if it's making sperm or eggs. If it's making sperm, it's called antheridium. If it's making eggs, it's called the archegonium. These are like testes and ovaries for plants. So in animals, we've got the gonads that are the things that make the gametes. And in animals, it's meiosis that does it, but in plants, it's mitosis. And here, the names of the one that makes sperm instead of testes, it's antheridium. The ones that makes the egg is archegonium. The etymology here, basically, Idiom or onium basically means something that houses it, okay? And this houses the gametes. This houses the anther. If you think about this, anther is the same word as anthro. Anthropology means male. So this makes the maleness in this sense, makes a sperm. Okay, the archegonium means arche, means the origins or early or ancient, like archaeology, the study of old early humans. Okay, goni is the same root as gyne, like gynecology. Gynecology literally means the ecology of femaleness, the environment that the female lives in. Really, the environment of the womb is technically what gynecology means. So this is the origin of the femaleness, the eggs. Okay, so the etymology is pretty straightforward if you know the roots, but the words are words I can almost guarantee none of you have ever heard before. Okay, so one antheridium, two antheridia, one archegonium, two archegonia. So that's going to be the first thing we're going to add. And the function of these is not only to produce the gametes, which is important, but really to protect the gametes. Because in seaweed, they don't need this. They just produce the sperm and eggs by mitosis and they just float away in the water and they're fine. But on land, you got to store them, you got to protect them, you got to keep them protected until it's ready to release them. The next step in plant reproductive evolution is going to be really important. We're going to keep that baby, the embryo, the zygote. When sperm and egg meet each other, they fertilize, they produce the single-celled zygote. The zygote divides by mitosis into the embryo, it's a multicellular baby. Okay, and we're going to keep that baby protected in an organ, which is actually going to be the archegonium, kind of like the womb. We're going to keep the baby protected in the archegonium in the parent plant until it's able to survive on its own, which typically means feed on its own, and keep that protected. Okay, this step, the retention of the embryo, keeping the baby sporophyte in the parent, is the technically best definition, synapomorphy, of what it means to be a land plant. Okay, the land plants are sometimes called the embryophytes, meaning the embryo producing plants. That's technically their true definition, but we'll just call them the land plants. They do live on land as well. Okay, so these are the two synapomorphies, terrestrial and producing an embryo that's retained on the parent. Now, because this is alternation of generation, this step is complicated. The baby embryo produced by fertilization is the start of the sporophyte phase. So the baby's a sporophyte. But the parent that produced it, that made the gametes, that are storing the baby in the archegonium, this is all in the gametophyte. So what we're doing here is keeping the baby sporophyte inside an organ of the parent gametophyte. When we get to the flowering plants, it gets more complicated, or in the seed plants, we're going to keep all of that in a grandparent sporophyte. So it's going to be very, very complicated. Okay, but basically the principles of this are similar. Protect the gametes, protect the future sporophyte. And then the third is a little mysterious. These first two we kind of understand in an adaptive fitness sense why they evolved. The third one is a little more mysterious. What we know is that the green algae and the earliest land plants are dominated by the gametophyte part of the life cycle. So they're what's called gametophyte dominant. And the sporophyte is really barely existent. In fact, it depends on the parent gametophyte. Whereas when we get to the ferns, the vascular plants, and then the seed plants, so it's a defining trait of the vascular plants, we switch from the gametophyte being important and switch to the sporophyte being important. And there at that point, then the gametophyte, when we get to the seed plants, the flowering plants especially, the gametophyte is only going to be found in the pollen and the seeds. And basically, the gametophyte almost doesn't exist anymore in the case of pollen. So we're going to switch from the gametophyte being most important early on to the sporophyte being most important. And why this happened is not really sure. It's hard to come up with a evolutionary fitness argument why that would be adaptive, better off, but we know it happened. Okay, so in a way, this is the reproduction of a green algae. We've got a gametophyte. It makes gametes. There's no gametangia. It does this by mitosis. This floats away in the water. They don't dry out. They find each other. They fertilize. We form the zygote. Not going to dry out because it's underwater. And then it grows up into the sporophyte. The sporophyte is diploid. It has sporangia that produce spores by meiosis. Again, they're going to float away, nothing's going to dry out, and the cycle starts over. By now, this should be straightforward. If you're still struggling with this, if what I just said seems like crazy Greek to you, you need to go back and start over and work through it and make sure you understand this. Because what we're going to do now is make this hard. So what plants do is they pick up here with green algae, and we're adding gametangia to produce the gametes. Then we're going to protect the baby inside the female gametangium, the archegonium. Those are the first two steps. We're going to protect and retain the baby. And then early on, we're going to start with the gametophyte, most important, and later on we'll shift to the sporophyte. So let's see how this plays out. Again, all we're going to do first is add gametangia and retain the embryo. So take this life cycle, and here's the life cycle of a moss. And so basically what we have is we have our gametangia, so our gametophytes. Here's our gametophyte. They have, we'll call them male and female, but those ideas don't really quite work with plants. But we have the male part of the plant that has the antheridium. This is basically the plant testes. They make the sperm. So here's the sperm being produced in this organ called the antheridium. And then maybe on the same plant, maybe on a different plant, we have a different organ, the archegonium, that makes the eggs by mitosis. In mosses, what happens, and in most early plants, you wait till it rains. The sperm gets released when it's wet out because the sperm is going to dry out. We have to protect that. So the sperm is going to swim in droplets of water. Maybe it's flooded, maybe it's droplets of rain, into a nearby archegonium. Hopefully there's an archegonium nearby. At this point, inside the archegonium, this is all of these next steps here are zoomed in views of an archegonium, this female organ. This egg is in there, the sperm swims in, they fertilize each other. Now we start the sporophyte. So this is still the parent's archegonium. We're still looking at the female part of this moss. We've zoomed in. Here's the future sporophyte. It's one cell. It's the zygote. It's diploid. Notice the color change at fertilization. Then this becomes multicellular. This is the embryo. We're retaining the embryo in the parent gametophyte, the baby sporophyte in the parent gametophyte. And then it's going to grow out by mitosis. And this is the sporophyte up here. It's still living inside the womb, if you want to call it that, in the archegonium. And in this species, the parent gametophyte is feeding through photosynthesis, passing sugars into the baby. Then when the sporophyte grows up as tall as it can, it produces a sporangium. The sporangium does meiosis, produces the spores, and then the spores, if you'll remember from last set of modules, are coated with a chemical. Can you remember it? Sporopollenin. It won't dry out at this point. Everything else would have dried out. The spores will not dry out because they're coated with sporopollenin. Then they go away. Hopefully in the wind, they find another moist patch of soil. They germinate or sprout, and then by mitosis become the gametophyte. So in mosses, this is what the typical plant looks like. It's all gametophyte, and this little hair-like structure with the sporangium on top is the sporophyte. What happens in a typical moss is that after meiosis, after this reproduces the spores, then the sporophyte dies, dries up, falls off, and then the gametophyte keeps living to reproduce again. In this case here, very importantly, the sperm still needs water to swim into the archegonium. So we've done first of our two steps. We've added gametangia, antheridia to make sperm, archegonia to make the egg, and then we retain the embryo. The next thing we do is switch to gametophyte dominant. And for that, you're going to have to wait until the next module.